Now, what's an example of a highly regulated industry?
So, highly regulated industries can include tobacco companies, alcohol companies, oil and gas companies, technology companies, financial services companies, healthcare companies. We've recently brought on some clients in the AI space and generative AI space, and also religious institutions. They have a level of regulation, but they're also really dealing with some reputational issues. And so our client base is really varied. And while our expertise is really in those highly regulated industries, one of the things that we've found as we've gone out to communities and had conversations is even if an organization or company has one local regulation, they feel highly regulated. So we are broadening our client base just to be able to help some of those small to medium sized organizations that might have a local or state regulation and not necessarily a national or global one, or the complexity of all three or four. But those industries that I mentioned are definitely the most highly regulated in the U.S.
These big companies, and I think oil and gas, alcohol, tobacco are quite visual for a lot of us to see. And throughout the world, we can see how the cigarette packages have changed over the years. In roughly around about 2002, 2003, I was in North Carolina. And when I went to the gas station, there was so much choice of tobacco. You could get tobacco, you could get smokeless tobacco, you could get chewing tobacco, you could get snuff, and it was everywhere.
Yeah.
And since then, I've realised that the packaging has rapidly changed. But even in Australia, we can't get chewing tobacco, we can't get Southern Pride, we can't get Levi Garrett, we can't get Skoal, we can't get Kodiak. That's highly regulated in Australia. So these bigger businesses, what reputational issues are they facing?
Well, you make a really good point in terms of locality and how much that matters to an industry or a corporation. How tobacco, for example, is regulated in Australia is very different than how it is in the US, is very different than how it is in Asia or different countries in Europe or Africa. And so my answer to the question, I'll answer it generally, but it really is dependent on locale. And so what we find in terms of reputational issues, particularly with the healthcare related, they have the public health component that really causes them to have the reputational issues. And then also we find like oil and gas has reputational issues around climate. Climate change is a big conversation at the moment. And also with new energy, solar energy, electric cars, automobiles, things of that nature. And so anytime that we see a real separation in an opposite goal, that's how we kind of determine where the reputational risk is. Is there a multi-million dollar industry that's pushing back on everything that you're saying? You're probably within our client profile. And so that's happening more and more, particularly as some of these new technologies and new businesses are evolving. But that's how we really kind of get to what is the reputational risk. And my advice is always to really try to establish trust and maintain that trust, because once it's broken, it is incredibly difficult to get it back. And so there is a process and a procedure and a methodology to look to rebuild trust. And so we go that route with some of our clients based on their histories and the nature of their businesses. But I really, really try to advise the CEOs we work with, the leadership in some organizations that we work with, like let's really focus on this idea of trust and always have it in the back of our mind as we're building out some of these other communication strategies.
It's interesting that you mentioned different regions. My wife and I were having a conversation yesterday, and here in Taiwan we have a nut, and it's called a betel nut. We call it binlang. And when you chew it, it's like a narcotic. It's like drinking about 10 Red Bulls at once. But when you chew it, it releases this red, almost like an ink. So your entire mouth will go red. And when the people who eat it smile at you, they look like they're zombies and they've been chewing on somebody's neck. And my wife said to me, could we take that to Australia? And I said, if we could, I think it would be $1 billion business. But I think our regulations are so strict that they wouldn't allow it in the country. Now, what's fascinating with this bin lung, you can buy it next to or from a cigarette store, but there's no labelling on it. And the Taiwanese call it green gold because it's so valuable in the community. They make so much money from this form of smokeless tobacco. But there's very few warnings on the packaging on how it's sold. And how it's sold is quite fascinating, is we have what's called a bin lung xiaojie. So when you drive down the street, normally in America you might have a 7-Eleven, you'll have the gas station, you can pull in, you can buy cigarettes. Here you pull up to a glass window, and in the glass window is a young Taiwanese woman in a bikini selling you smokeless tobacco. And it's such a contrast, because if you go next door and buy cigarettes, they've got all these warnings of people with mouth cancer and tongue cancer and lung cancer, and those photos are all on the packages. But when you buy the bin lung, you're buying it from a Taiwanese woman who's in a bikini. And it's such a contrast. And my wife said, if we could do that in Australia, we could make $1 billion. And I said, the Aussies would love it. But the issue is getting it into the country. It's a very regulated industry. And so that's what's happening in our community. And so
that's interesting.
Maybe we call it a success. Maybe it's a failure.
Well, look, in bringing any type of product to, and I'm not familiar with that particular nut, although it sounds interesting. But
I still haven't eaten it after a decade.
I always encourage companies that are looking to bring a particular product, particularly if they suspect it's going to be highly regulated depending on the market they're bringing it to have the conversations with consultancies and people like myself, my firm, or others that have expertise in that area, because you never know. And so maybe it might not be possible in that particular year, but chances are there's a level of expertise that might be able to bring it to market in some form. Maybe it might not be what you anticipate it's going to be, but in some form in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. A lot of these highly regulated organizations, if they don't wait until the crisis moment, they've been either fighting regulations or building their own regulations or really setting the stage for how it is they want their business to operate from a long-term strategy perspective. And so I always encourage folks, if you have an idea, particularly if it's $1 billion idea, don't just say, no, it's not possible. Start to get folks on your team with a level of expertise that can hopefully help make it happen for you.
One big shift I've noticed in Australian sports is many years ago, tobacco companies would be sponsoring social events. They would sponsor the football games, the car races, all the big events. But now we don't tend to see the tobacco companies sponsoring them, yet we still see the alcohol companies sponsoring things like car events. But also the government says don't drink and drive. Yet you've got these alcohol companies advertising alcohol at a car racing event. And I believe that there's probably a different, viewpoint in the community. So within the community, how are these bigger corporations failing in the eyes of the community?
Yeah. So some of the ways that these types of organizations are failing more broadly is that they are waiting for that crisis moment instead of doing that preparation ahead of time. Because a lot of what we see probably can be mitigated. Maybe it can't be eliminated completely. Maybe it can. But it can probably be mitigated with some preparation and some anticipation going forward. And so I always get really excited when clients come to us and they're not in the crisis phase yet. And we can really see that impact on the other side. Also, what we see is oftentimes organizations or companies or even whole industries are operating in an echo chamber, and they're not listening and don't have a good pulse on what's happening in broader society and what trends. And so I always encourage, particularly the leadership of these organizations, and I know that it's tough. I know that it's tough because you have so many things going on, and it's not always possible to just keep a broad awareness, but try, because it really can be either transformational for your business or extremely detrimental to your business if you're hit with something that you're not anticipating.
Many years ago, I was working with Emirates Airline, and we had a team that was called CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management. And every quarter, we were preparing for an aircraft disaster. So, big company, global reach, huge team, and there was about 2,000 team members in the Critical Incident Stress Management Department. And we were constantly training and drilling for one of these big events. And it was quite fascinating to see that, because coming from small business, we really never thought about the crisis. We were nimble, we could be really quick, we could turn on a dime as a little company, but we would have never considered these catastrophic events or even going into a crisis. So for those companies that are now growing and scaling, and they're going to come to that crossroads where they do have a crisis, how do you help them turn that around?
We come in and we do, depending on the nature of the issue or the overall objective, we come in and we do an audit, either external or internal or both. And so we establish what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the threats. And then based on the data, and again, the objectives, we work with the organization on communication strategies. And then if needed, sometimes we pass it off to their teams. For the smaller mid-sized companies, we also provide the coordination and management of those strategies if needed as well. One of the things that I really try to not impose, but really just try to make the point that when people think about highly regulated or lobbying or government affairs or public policy, they're like, oh, we have a lobbyist or we have a lobbying shop. I get it. I've been a lobbyist. We have lobbyists on our team. Lobbying is not enough when you're dealing with these types of reputational issues and in highly regulated industries. You really need to have a broader holistic strategy that pulls in communications, both digital and person and traditional. And you need to have a social impact community-based strategy as well. And all of that needs to be integrated. And all of those components help drive the different public policy, communications, and social impact goals forward. But without those three prongs, it's extremely difficult to be able to navigate in an effective and successful way, particularly if you're looking for shorter term results and you don't want to wait 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot for a business owner to take on.
Yeah.
When I started my business, I would have never envisioned anything like that in my business. And the reason why I say that is because the field that I work in is totally deregulated all around the world, and I can't even comprehend some of these things in my mind. And I'm sure there's millions of business people out there who start, like myself, they grow, then they've got to come to this crossroad, and all of a sudden, people are coming in to look behind the veil of your business. They're looking at the operations, the components, the systems. For the business owner, what's their personal journey? How do they feel about this?
We have varied responses when we get to that point in the conversation. What I can say, to your point, because it is a lot, I applaud organizations for bringing in the help, for saying, this is a lot, we don't have time.
Help is not a dirty word.
Hope is not a dirty word. No. Exactly. So I applaud them for bringing on that help and being willing to have those conversations. And it makes me excited because that means for me that they're looking at the long term of their business. And this is likely going to be a business that will be able to weather the storm, because you and I both know we're business owners. There will be storms, but looking at that long-term strategy, they're putting people in place, even if they can't afford to hire a whole team, or even if they can't afford to hire certain folks internally. They have set aside some budget for consultants to handle it. That way they can ensure this piece is taken care of, and they don't have to think about it because they have experts taking care of it for them on the other side.
I think this is a very important point for all business people, that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. And as a business owner, you're going to be very strong in the key areas that help you grow your business, and you're going to be weak in other areas. But you've got to be able to ask for help. And asking for help in Australia over the years has become a dirty word. If you ask for help, it means you're weak. It means you don't know enough. It means that you don't have control. But that's not what it really means. Strong people ask for help. And there's people like yourself who have dedicated themselves to this line of work. People like yourself who are attracted to this type of field. So what I'm curious about is, out of all the paths you could have taken, why did you end up choosing this career path?
When people look at my resume, they say I've done a little bit of everything, which I suppose that can be true, but there is a thread, and that thread is being of service to people. I've been a lawyer, I've been a lobbyist, I've worked in the U.S. Congress, I've worked in corporate. And so, but that thread is being of service. And I've always worked on behalf of people generally. And I truly, truly believe that the best way to serve people and communities is to have those open conversations and dialogues between government, corporations, and community. It's the three prongs of the Averity group. It's social impact, communications, and public policy. And when you have those three things in alignment, people thrive, communities thrive, and businesses thrive.